becoming a leftist is more than just like understanding the theory and thinking it's a good idea. So something that I talked about last time was that I used to be more socially conservative but economically egalitarian, and then after a while changed my mind on that. And so I'm going to go into sort of how the change came about between my politics back in high school and my politics sort of 10, 15 years later now. So it wasn't that someone kind of sat me down and explained to me that like you can't have economic egalitarianism without having it be fair for absolutely everyone. The change that came about in me was really through learning compassion. I'm going to talk a lot about Christianity, but this is not about Christianity. I'm getting to a point, so just bear with me. So I grew up in a Christian environment, and I also went to high school when a lot of atheists were becoming very vocal from reading Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and a lot of these people were my friends. Which may surprise you a little bit. I was kind of known as the good Christian because I didn't have quite as many problematic views. I was much more willing to, acknowledge the fact that there were some issues with creationism, and even come to abandon the literal interpretation of the Genesis story. But in my mind, the important thing was Jesus. It was keeping my eyes focused on following Jesus. I knew at the time that I didn't really know what that meant, and I couldn't get a good answer out of anyone, but that's what was important. It wasn't like, how did the world come into being? It was following that, which, that's a pretty non-problematic kind of a viewpoint to have. I actually found an old note that I'd written ages ago when I was just writing it doesn't matter if it's creationism or evolution or some combination, because the important thing is that we follow the teachings of the gospel, which, yeah, I mean, if you look at the teachings of the gospel, it's pretty much don't be shitty to people, heal the sick and all that. But I hadn't quite come to internalize that sort of core element of it at the time, because I was in a very Christian environment. My family's never been that conservative. In fact, they've been very, very progressive in a lot of ways. But I was still in a church environment, and therefore surrounded by a lot of sort of more fundamentalist ideas, a lot more literal interpretations of the Bible. And sort of being in that kind of environment, which was full of people who were reacting against this very atheistic wave, which as time went on was being tied more and more with gay rights, and whether or not it was okay to be gay was one of the big splits between Christians and atheists. And the Christian justification for vilifying people from the LGBT community came down to a few cherry-picked verses taken out of context and also translated in a very particular way. If you want to learn about the full breakdown of that, Damon Garcia has done some videos that have been all about that kind of stuff. If you're interested in radical left interpretations of scripture, definitely check Damon Garcia out. In a similar kind of a vein as well, there were a lot of verses from the Bible that were being focused on about how women had to be subservient to men, which again, done without the full context of the culture it was part of, one specific translation, a bunch of cherry-picked verses taken out of context, all that stuff. And the more you look into it, the more you realize that it's actually, the New Testament is hella egalitarian. But anyway, my point is that, yeah, that was the environment that I was in, and that's why a lot of my beliefs were a bit more conservative outside of economic theory. The thing that changed me was not a theory. I stopped having sexist views when I had some friends who were girls who pulled me up on some of my shit. And they didn't explain things to me in terms of theory, but the more women that I got to know and hear about some of the stories, about some of the shit they've been through and that their friends had been through, and even stories of their mothers, I began to understand that the problem was a lot bigger and more visceral than what I had appreciated. Because for me, gender politics was purely theoretical, and I didn't realize that it was any further than that, which is why theory wasn't the thing to shake me out of it. It was seeing that it was more than just theory, and that the beliefs that I was holding, being held by people, was something that had material effects on people that I was becoming friends with. And then the same thing happened with gay rights with me, because a very close friend of mine came out. And I'd already been sort of teetering more and more as time went on. Because like I said, I had a lot of friends who were atheists in high school. who were also a lot more progressive than me. And they had very good arguments. And the only thing that I had to counter it, not that I argued with them because I was interested in hearing what they had to say, but the only counter argument that I'd been exposed to was what the Bible says. And the Bible's got some good stuff in there, don't get me wrong, but it's been used in a very, shall we say, philosophically shaky manner. Anyway, all of this rambling is just to get to this point, which is that the thing that got me to become a better leftist and a better comrade and all this, and even just to fully commit to being on board the leftist politics train, was learning compassion. You know, it wasn't someone intellectually convincing me that I was wrong. It wasn't someone, I mean, it was partly that, but it was mostly the stuff that I got told that was attached to real stories about people that I cared about. And I can only describe that kind of change as a spiritual one. You know, you may not believe in God. In fact, if you're on the political left, there's a good chance that you don't. I'm not entirely sure what I believe, to be honest. If you want to know what I think, then I wrote an essay called The Bovis Manifesto, which you can go watch, well, listen to, really. There's a few pictures. But the word spirituality, to me, kind of means that sort of human essence, you know, our propensity for compassion. And everyone has that, you know, like everyone is compassionate in some way. People's compassion might just have some borders on it. You know, it could only extend to white people, or it could only extend to straight people, or it could only extend to Christians, or any combination of any group of people. Last time I talked about how we can't have economic egalitarianism without social egalitarianism. But the thing that I want to say in this video is that the only way that we can get people to a point of joining us in working towards those things is through an emotional change that is so profound that that the only word that really describes it is a spiritual change. And like I said, you don't have to believe in God, you don't have to believe in spirits or anything, because it doesn't have to be that literally spiritual, but you know what I mean, right? It sort of gets you on that, you know, deep down in here. In here. Oh, I'm an idiot. We on the left have been so caught up in theory and praxis. But it's more than that, though. Like, being human involves more than just theory and praxis. It involves some kind of human spirit, something that, you know, the part of us that gets attached to art, the part of us that is moved deeply by things. And if we on the left can't appeal to that, the right have a cheap version of it already. Like, they have these, you know, we are one solid unit together, and if you're with us, you can belong. You know, like, that is a spiritual appeal. You know, and you can argue theory all you want, but ultimately it's going to be colored by what your internal beliefs are. An issue I had with a recent philosophy tube video, Data, was that I have a friend who's actually made a lot of the arguments that the bouncer makes. If you haven't seen it, it's a conversation between a bouncer and someone trying to get into a club, and the bouncer needs some data from the guy trying to get in, and so then they have a Socratic dialogue about that and whether it's okay for data harvesting to happen, basically. So I have a friend who, believes everything that Ellis, the bouncer, believed, but the problem is that I've never been able to convince him that data harvesting is bad, because for me, data harvesting is a thing that gives a lot of power to one party and takes it away from another, and that's unequal and therefore bad. But you can't. That's not a good argument if someone doesn't already value egalitarianism, and you don't value egalitarianism unless you've had that change where you suddenly, like where the light comes on, and all of a sudden you understand that, hey, actually compassion is a great thing. You know, you can't have egalitarianism without compassion. And compassion is something that can only be cultivated through spiritual experience. Again, like coming into contact with someone who you're close with who has that experience. It's the same way that, like, you see this quite a bit with conservatives, where where they meet someone who's migrated illegally and they become friends with them, and then they sort of see that person as the one good one. The difference is that if that's an experience that turns into a leftist, is that you then generalize that. If you meet several migrants who've migrated illegally, then you kind of are much more likely to generalize your compassion. Yeah. So anyway, so what I'm saying is generalized compassion is something that you can't logic your way into, but it is something that can happen, but you need to create the right experiences. And this is why art is so important. And I'll be talking a bit more about art next time. So if you're enjoying this series, please subscribe, give it a like, comment, maybe add it to a playlist if you want to. You can check out my poetry and my other art on my website, jamescfinlay.com, link in the D-box. And you can also support me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and you will get a digital copy of all the art that I make. So stay safe, look after people, and until next time, much love.